This
Ooh.
conference will now be recorded.
Hello, I'm Meg Baker, and if you try to talk over the recording message, it comes out funny. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. It's nice to have one person for feedback. I'm a reference librarian at the West Windsor Branch Library, and I'm here. My sole purpose is to introduce Annelise Heinz, whose name I have probably completely botched, but that's okay. She's a professor of history at the University of Oregon. Her work has been published, featured on National Public Radio and international Chinese television. She has lived and played Mahjong in the United States and southwestern China, and she is the author of Mahjong, a Chinese game and the making of a modern American culture, published by Oxford University Press in May of 2021. So that's the basic facts about our presenter, although I'm sure she will tell you more as she goes along. As far as just repeating some of what Laura said, you will be muted. Please stay muted and just put in all of your questions in the chat box as you go along. I'll be monitoring them, and then when Annalisa is ready for the questions, I will bring my face back and we will talk the questions back and forth so you can hear all of the questions and answers. Okay, so I am now going to vanish and hand off to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to share my screen as I show images throughout the talk. And hopefully that transition works out. Meg will let me know if not. Just setting that up right now. Okay. Did that image come through? Meg, can you see it?
We can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is a picture of the copy of my book, Mahjong, a Chinese game in the making of modern American culture. And in that title is a big question. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today. How did a Chinese game shape the making of modern American culture? And as I talk, you might have thoughts or memories, things that resonate for you related to what I'm saying. And I encourage you to share your thoughts and memories in the chat as we go. And again, at the end, I'll be able to answer questions, and I invite your thoughts and your questions. Great. But before I dive into the history of the game, I like to make sure everyone is on the same page. I know this audience probably has some longtime Mahjong players, and that is fabulous. I won't be teaching you how to play the game today. There are lots of excellent instructors out there, and if you don't know already, I encourage you to learn. But what I will be talking about today is the history of the game, and particularly its social and cultural ramifications in the United States. We might have folks in the audience who maybe grew up around the game, maybe are just familiar with the computer solitaire matching tiles, which is actually a very different game, but the tiles look the same. And this talk is for you too. But I like to make sure that at least everybody knows going into it what Mahjong is. So Mahjong is a game of skill played by 4 people with tiles instead of cards. And the tiles, this is an image of tiles from the 1920s when they were made out of bone and bamboo. And you can see the bone face is carved to make suits of tiles, which you can see here. If you play a kind of Mahjong that's commonly called today American Mahjong, or the National Mahjong League's version of it, your set looks a little bit different. And we'll talk about how and why those changes occurred. The most common question I'm asked when I'm talking about my book is how I came to Mahjong and how I came to this topic more generally. And that story is connected to my year in China teaching English to graduate students at Yunnan University. And this is a picture I took of the first Mahjong game I ever played when a friend taught me the very basic version of the traditional Chinese game that her grandfather had taught her. And as any player here will be able to relate to, I was immediately captivated by the sensory aspects of the tiles. The way they sound when you're shuffling or washing the tiles between rounds, the way they click when you put them in your rack, which people do in the United States, but not in most other places in the world, or stand them on their end on the table. The way the tiles feel in your hand, they're cool and smooth and heavy, and they're really beautiful. The designs are beautiful, and each set tells its own unique story. And while I was living in China, my aunt visited me, and she's not Jewish, but she grew up in a strongly Jewish neighborhood in Denver, Colorado, in the 1950s and 60s. And at the time, a lot of her friends' mothers played Mahjong. And then later, as a middle-aged woman who went to the JCC regularly and still connected with a lot of those old friends, a lot of her friends now played Mahjong. And so she just asked the question, why do my Jewish friends and their mothers play this apparently Chinese game? And that was an interesting question. The connection's not obvious. And I thought, well, we could just look that up online. Someone would have answered it. And what I found is that a lot of people had asked the question. A lot of people had generated theories. There was a lot of misinformation that was commonly repeated, but no one had done the historical research to find out. And that really got me started on a kind of research quest while I got my doctorate at Stanford. And that is the question I pursued in my dissertation and eventually turned my dissertation into a book. So I've been working on this project now for a dozen years, and it's really been a kind of needle in the haystack research adventure. And this is just a montage of just a little peek into the many different kinds of sources that I found and that I use to tell this story of Mahjong's American history. And the research has taken me all over to lots of different places. There is no archive for Mahjong yet, but it included a room of old games right off the factory floor of an old Parker Brothers factory, as well as the living rooms and dining rooms of dozens of people who were kind enough to let me interview them and share their personal stories, such as Hilda Schaefer, who you can see here. And we'll come back to Hilda particularly, and also the story connected to Jewish heritage that she and my other interviewees illuminated. But in the book, I end the story with this answer to this question of how it became a part of Jewish American women's culture after World War II. But Mahjong's history begins decades earlier, and its history in the United States begins earlier as well. And so it's to that story we'll now turn. And I'll just give a brief kind of snapshot of this story as we go. Everything I talk about and more is in the book. So I'm happy to elaborate at any point, again, during the Q&A. And I encourage you to read the book where there's a lot more information about all of it. So Mahjong's origins were in the mid to late 19th century area of Shanghai, the Yangtze River Delta. And a lot of people in the United States and in fact around the world believe that Mahjong is an ancient game, thousands of years old. It's one of the most commonly repeated myths about the game's history. In fact, it's just a relatively recent game. It's a modern game, again, of the mid to late 1800s. At the time, it was one of many mostly male, mostly gambling games that was becoming increasingly known in certain major urban centers, particularly Shanghai and Beijing. But it was, again, one of many games that existed at the time. And this is an image of a courtesan hall in Shanghai in the 1890s. Now, what is also true is that today, and really for decades now, Mahjong has been both a men's and women's game, and they might play separately and together. Even in its origins, women played Mahjong, but it was a mostly male game, and it could always be played for very, very high stakes as a gambling game, as well as a game that you could play for pennies. And that's unusual for a game to be able to span this whole spectrum of gambling for very high or very low stakes. And it's part of how it has a lot of social flexibility that enables it to move into different kinds of social spaces. So Mahjong was becoming increasingly popular in China, but was really not very widely known. Today, Mahjong is known in China and around the world as the national game of China. And that's a big transformation. How and why that happened is connected to its transition to the American market in the early 20th century. So the Mahjong first enters American society not because it was carried by immigrants and slowly diffused into a broader public, but in fact because it was marketed very intentionally as a exciting consumer good, not only but especially importantly by Joseph Park Babcock, who was a who was a Standard Oil representative in the area around Shanghai. And very unusually, he learned enough Chinese to communicate with locals. Most foreigners didn't bother to learn Chinese at that time, but he learned Mahjong, saw its potential as something that could become widely popular, made a few small changes and adjustments to the game, and then he and his wife and business partners launched a full-scale marketing campaign in 1922 via California. And they marketed it especially as a new and exotic consumer good. And the fad took off beyond their wildest expectations. Soon, everyone was talking about playing the game, from President and First Lady Harding in the White House to Hollywood starlets and celebrities, small town newspapers in Nebraska and the Pacific Northwest, Spanish language newspapers in Texas. Everyone was talking about this new chic game of society. And so as the market takes off, Western and Chinese entrepreneurs launch new large-scale tile-making factories that combined handcrafted artisanal manufacturing techniques with large-scale standardized production. And here is an image of two craftsmen cutting the cow bone that will become a part of the tile. And here you can see it on the caption, first process in making Mahjong, cutting shin bones from USA. So this fad took off so hugely that they actually ran out of the Chinese supply of cow shin bones and had to import huge amounts from the United States, where there was a huge cattle slaughtering industry. So coming out of the Chicago stockyards, being shipped out of Texas on steamships that would have crossed paths with steamships carrying the finished product of Mahjong sets in their holds for sale to an American market. And in fact, this fad spread around the world so that European royalty, society in India and North Africa and Australia and Latin America were all, again, part of this global Mahjong phenomenon for a few years. This advertisement is really typical of how the game was marketed. This is from a department store in Sacramento, California, and you can see that this imagery emphasizes a kind of ornate sense of representations of Chinese culture and Chinese goods, as well as this group of fashionable white women dressed in, some of them in Chinese-inspired robes, which was really typical of what we'll talk about next in terms of the culture surrounding Mahjong consumption. And you can see in this image and the newspaper coverage a real emphasis on this idea of exoticism as connected to Chinese culture and Chinese people. And part of what happens during these fad years is that white women dress up in Chinese costume to play the game and to host Mahjong parties. Women like this society matron in Los Angeles, who's dressed in what she imagines to be ancient royal Chinese costume. We'll talk again in just a minute about how this connection already with the game, with this idea of ancient royal Chinese culture. And those costumes were inspired by things like what they had seen in Chinese operas. There were also very official kinds of performances. This is a Vanderbilt daughter dressed as a flower tile in a ballet, Mahjong themed ballet in New York City. Middle-class housewives could read articles like this one in a newspaper from Atlanta, Georgia, that described how to host a Chinese-themed party, which was, quote, all the rage. And here you can see elements that represented what Americans associated with Chinese culture. Everything from tea to lanterns to Pekingese dogs and embroidered robes. And that was part of how the game became so widely popular, was connected to this idea of excitement, exoticism, but also an opportunity for white women to get to experiment with new boundaries of femininity and sexuality that I talk more about again in the book. And at the same time, the Mahjong fad took off right in the midst of new developments of mass marketing techniques, from including advertising and these immersive kinds of store displays. So this is a department store where, again, you see a white sales girl, also in Chinese-inspired costume, her hair in buns, and around her, this kind of accoutrement that all meant to create an immersive shopping experience, and also connected to this idea of exoticism, where representations of China, Japan, India, and even the Middle East would all kind of be mixed and swirled together, as was very commonly ideas held in the United States and Europe at the time, where the East just kind of got lumped together and really posed in opposition to or opposite to ideas about the West. And some of those ideas of the East were that it was luxurious, but also that it was backwards and associated with, again, a real sense of outsiderness. In fact, until 1952, Asian Americans could not naturalize into citizenship, American citizenship, regardless of how long they had been in the country, because one of the core ideas connected to ideas of Asian people was that they were inherently unassimilable, that they were so different that they could never become a part of the national community. So all of those ideas of otherness connected to excitement as well as distance were wrapped up in the Mahjong fad. So how and why did this game become so popular in the midst of 1920s stereotypes of China that were often very negative, and that was actually a time of increased anti-immigrant sentiment, the mainstream popularization of groups like the Ku Klux Klan? The 1920s were actually a very racist era. So how did a game that was emphasized as a Chinese game become so popular and in fact inspire people to dress up in what they imagine to be Chinese costume? Well, a key part of that is this myth that it was an ancient game. So alongside stereotypes, negative stereotypes of contemporary Chinese society, again, thinking of it as backwards, but also associated with things like cheap chop suey or working class laborers, alongside those stereotypes were also ideas of an ancient Chinese society that was a paragon of earlier civilization. And so Mahjong is advertised and marketed explicitly as an ancient and royal Chinese game. And marketers often say and argue, we're selling the authentic version of the game that was part of this ancient royal Chinese court. And in fact, modern day Chinese people have degraded the game. They've ruined it, but we're selling you the actual original version. All of that was false, but it was very effective because it tapped into those positive stereotypes and at the same time allowed white Americans to distance their embrace of the game from contemporary Chinese Americans. And so part of what you see in advertisements like this is a repetition of images of the Mandarin or a court official, often again with a kind of Fu Manchu facial hair, long fingernails, these representations that emphasized a distancing from contemporary modern people. Now, it's worth pointing out that Chinese Americans were navigating this fad in complex ways for their own purposes. And in these fad years, many Chinese Americans took advantage of its popularity to market themselves as, quote, authentic instructors, even if they had learned the game right alongside these broader, their broader white customers. Instructors like these two men in Los Angeles, who also took the opportunity in the context of a highly discriminatory economy, where even if they had been able to achieve higher education by attending a university that accepted Asian students at the time, such as University of California, they couldn't get jobs that reflected those degrees after they graduated. Instead, they were tended to be tracked in these same low-wage, dead-end work, such as restaurant work, domestic service, and curio shops. But during the Mahjong fad years, there was a window of opportunity that Chinese Americans could leverage for a higher paying economic opportunity attached to how white Americans perceived them. And so again, this is a complicated and often painful kind of negotiation. But Mahjong was never just a white driven fad. In fact, it not only crossed groups of class and race in the fad, it was also becoming a really important part of Chinese American culture. And that happens in these years too. So in the 1920s and 1930s, it becomes embedded in a landscape of Chinatowns that were both outward facing towards tourists and consumers and inward facing to Chinese American communities. And I talk a lot more about that in the book, but I'll just leave you with this image of a 1942 general store in New York City's Chinatown. And you can't see a Mahjong set in this image, but there was almost certainly one either under this bureau or in the back room, which you can see a little bit on the side there, where Mahjong games were almost always going in the back of these general stores. And general stores were places where you'd have all these different streams of the diverse kinds of Chinese American communities in and around Chinatown. It would cross paths in general stores. And again, Mahjong was very, very often going in the back room. So the fad dies out by the late 1920s, but pockets of players remain. Certainly, Chinese Americans continue playing Mahjong, and other pockets of players do as well. One of those pockets was the seed of what would become the connection to Jewish American women's culture. And this image is from the late 1930s, after the fad years, but before World War II. And it's advertising a company led by a woman named Dorothy Meyerson, who had changed certain elements of the game in her mind to help bring it back into popularity and to sell sets as well, which she's advertising here. And she joins forces with a group of other, mostly Jewish women in the New York area to create the National Mahjong League in 1937. And this is the seed of how, quote, American Mahjong, which is not the only American version, but is certainly the most widespread, uniquely American version of the game, begins to take off and really develop its own unique trajectory. So in the late 1930s, this group of women created the league. This picture was taken shortly after their founding. And Dorothy Meyerson plays a really important role in shaping and creating the base of the game that they then shepherd and change significantly from the traditional Chinese version. It's worth pointing out here that, as I just mentioned, the League's version is not the only uniquely American variation of the game. Today, there are more than 40 variations of the Mahjong that exist around the world. But another uniquely American variation also really takes off during this time, and it begins during World War II by a group of Air Force officers' wives at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. And so today, you can still find Wright-Pat Mahjong, which is what it's called, at Air Force bases around the country. And there, this picture is from the early 1960s, when you can see a couple of their, the leaders of the group instructing on how to complete their winning hands, which actually are named. And it's, you can see here they have a lot of military themes in their names, like Pearl Harbor and Independence. But Dorothy Meyerson is actually a part of this story too, because as I mentioned, she had her own business. She continued her own business even after the League began, and she sells sets to these Air Force officers' wives for the versions of Mahjong that they're developing alongside each other. So I will call the League's version of the game American Mahjong because that's how it's most commonly known. But I like to point out that it is, in fact, not the only American version, and the League called its version National Mahjong. So that's another way to refer to it. Again, the League's version does become the most widespread American variation. And it is a fundamentally different game in many ways than the traditional Chinese version. Over a period of decades, the League experimented with how to make changes that, again, they felt would better reflected what their community members, the members of the League, wanted in the game. They were influenced by things like canasta players. A lot of Mahjong players were canasta players as well, and they would write in with suggestions, or they would show up to these meetings and make arguments for changes that the League should make. And so between the late 1930s and the early 1960s, the League is significantly changing, for example, how many flower tiles should be included. And at the time, they were using flower tiles as a kind of wild card. So it was really introducing different amounts of luck in the game. And in the early 1960s, again, from the influence of canasta players, they introduced joker tiles for the first time. And this picture then is taken right around this time when they introduce joker tiles, which quickly stabilize then into the set that we know as an American Mahjong set today. But one key change that they made very early on, and this was again directly influenced by Dorothy Meyerson, was to move away from the traditional Chinese way of playing the game, which is very similar to gin rummy, where there are limited forms of winning hands, but many different ways to get there. And in the traditional Chinese game, scoring is very, very important. In the League's version, they create a set of around 60 possible winning hands, and they publish those in an annual card. And that card changes every year. And this is totally unique. If you go somewhere else in the world and see someone playing with a card that looks like that, they're playing the League's version of Mahjong. And you can see here that this set looks quite different from the tiles that we saw in the 1920s. By the 1960s, you have some significant changes in the material aspects of the sets. No longer made of bone and bamboo, these were tiles made of plastic in and around the New York area in particular. And you can also see these colored racks that are connected with the game, packed in a backgammon style case. All of these mark the physical Americanization of the game into something that looks actually different in certain ways than the traditional Chinese game. And even today, there are fundamental differences in the sets, but you'll also see in this image a connection across the years to those original Chinese designs, and those get incorporated even as there are many other changes in the sets. So the card then also becomes a kind of business and philanthropic idea. So every year requires a new card with new winning hands. The league sells that card. And because at the time, the people who ran the league were all women of economic means, they not only didn't need to work to support themselves or their families, if they had worked for wages, they actually would have lost status. They would have lost social status. So these were women who were volunteering their time. And you can see they're channeling a kind of entrepreneurial spirit into this nonprofit venture. And yet selling the card meant that after they covered their expenses, they had money. And they used that money to donate to philanthropic causes. Here you can see them advertising this during the war years also as a patriotic kind of way to support the war effort. And that is a really key part of how they advertise themselves, market themselves, and how they spread among Jewish women's networks, many of whom were also connected to philanthropic organizations and could sell cards to their own communities to generate funds for their chosen causes. Today, the League is no longer run by volunteers, but philanthropy is still an important part of how members are invested in doing things like selling cards and getting to choose philanthropic donations. So why was the game spreading along these Jewish women's networks? Why did it become an important part of Jewish women's lives after World War II? A key part of that answer is the League. That would not have happened without the League. But it's also about the broader story of middle-class Jewish life in the post-war era. And those are connected to economic and social changes that were happening, including new leisure patterns that were forged by Jewish Americans, not only in the Catskill Mountains, but especially influentially in the Catskill Mountains, just north of New York City, where women and children would leave the city to escape the sweltering heat of the summer. Husbands would go back and forth. Even working women would seasonally leave their work if they could to actually take their families to places like bungalow colonies, which are a key part of the development of Mahjong culture. So in bungalow colonies, women's domestic responsibilities lightened. Children were at day camp, they were off doing their own thing. Women were able to not cook as much or as elaborately, not clean as extensively. All of that kind of domestic work lessened. And they were there without their husbands during the week. And so they really gathered together and connected over shared activities like Mahjong that were just about having fun together. And this Mahjong then becomes a key part of transferring a little slice of those summer leisured rhythms with them when they went back home. When it was no longer the summer, when they were no longer getting the kind of structural reprieve from their domestic duties, Mahjong night is one night a week that spreads in Jewish communities and becomes a kind of cultural norm where women were culturally accepted and in fact expected to go to each other's homes and play Mahjong, gathering together not to put their energy towards supporting a PTA or a synagogue sisterhood, but in fact, again, just to have fun together and also to have some intellectual stimulation. So one part of this story is that Jewish Americans were experiencing the post-war rush to the suburbs in particularly accentuated ways. In an era of already very high suburbanization rates, Jewish Americans moved to the suburbs at 4 times the rate, that national average. And that was happening because after World War II, after the Nazis had become the enemy, after the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, anti-Semitism was no longer mainstream acceptable. I'm not saying it was eradicated. We know that it was not, but it was no longer the 1920s, 1930s era of really explicit anti-Semitic restrictions on things like housing or higher education. And so you see some legal reductions against anti-Semitic restrictions, some protections, and Jewish Americans and Italian Americans become part of this new group called white ethnics. And they're able to, with, again, not with complete equal access, but with greatly increased toward equal access to Protestant Americans, able to access things like mortgages and certain professional tracks. And that was not true for African Americans. Regionally, that was not true for Hispanics or Asian Americans, but it is now increasingly true for Italians and Jewish Americans. And at the same time, Jewish American women were more likely than average to have higher education and then participating in this kind of post-war suburban boom where they left the workforce, left some of those communities and raised young children. And so Mahjong becomes a really key lifeline for many young mothers who are gathering together. And this is really nationally consistent. So going back to that image here, right before the suburbs, of these young mothers, in this case in a Philadelphia row house, but as well as this group in Valdosta, Georgia, and this group in Brooklyn in an apartment building's dinette. And all of these patterns are so consistent that I talked to dozens of people who either played Mahjong at that time or grew up in those households. And they all share the same memories of falling, as if they were children, falling asleep to the sound of the Mahjong ladies laughing and clicking the tiles. You can see here, this is a photograph now that Hilda Schaefer took, coming back to Hilda Schaefer. This is in her dinette. And you can see this woman's hand tapping out her cigarette next to a pineapple shell. Pineapple wedges with maraschino cherries on top. It was all part of this shared culture. And at the same time, very unusually, they had to rely on and expect other people, like their husbands, to take care of the children that night. The family did not get to eat the special food that was made for the Mahjong ladies until Mahjong night was over. So it was really an unusual kind of temporary transformation of the purpose of domestic space and labor for women who shared, again, this life stage together. Over and over again, people talked about how I already mentioned it was a lifeline. People talked about it as therapy. And part of that is because also during the Mahjong play, you have these pauses between rounds because it takes longer to shuffle the Mahjong tiles and rebuild the wall than it does to shuffle a deck of cards. And that creates a special kind of rhythm so that people can talk and connect with each other. And as they're moving to these new neighborhoods, it's a way to get to know new people or keep those relationships with the old neighbors alive. And as Jewish Americans are participating in the possibilities that come with this new upward mobility, access to the quote American dream of the suburban ideal, that also comes with a lot of risks of cultural loss, of an assimilation into Protestant American culture. And so I think one of the things that Mahjong does, although no one talks about it explicitly in this way at the time, is that it serves as a kind of subtle demarcation of Jewish neighborhoods and Jewish space, so that even when Italian neighbors, Italian Catholic neighbor women would be invited into Mahjong games, as they were, it was because they were being invited into a predominantly Jewish space. A Jewish space marked not by a religious tradition or ritual, but instead by a Chinese game, therefore associated again with a sense of being outside of dominant American society and also not a predominantly Christian society, and a game that had become really Americanized but was no longer a part of mainstream American culture. So I think that, on a very subtle level, played an important role too. And so this image is from a contemporary artist who portrays aspects of the modern Jewish experience that he says, quote, ties us all together. So I think it's significant that Mahjong is one of the things he chose. So just to wrap up, today there are more than 40 variations of Mahjong that exist around the world. And that adaptability creates barriers as well as bridges. It means that there is this incredibly diverse and vibrant Mahjong culture in many different places. And at the same time, it also means that people who are playing Mahjong and know how to play it in, for example, Vietnam, can't just sit down and play with someone who's playing the Filipino version or the National Mahjong League's version or the version popular in Shanghai. So there are enough distinguishing elements that it has also branched into meaningfully different kinds of play. And I'll leave you with a couple of takeaway points that I always hope people walk away with. One is that Mahjong's American history is rooted in the tension between inclusion and exclusion, as well as the risks of cultural erasure through appropriation or assimilation. Mahjong thus reveals the deeply American experience, sometimes desired and sometimes enforced, of simultaneously belonging and standing apart. And the other thing that I hope people take away with is that everyday people make culture. Working class folks, middle class housewives, people whose voices are often not kept in archives, people who may not even see themselves as important makers of history. We are all making history, and we can pay attention to the rituals and communities that we shape our lives around as well. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And now we'll begin with the questions. I've got a couple already lined up here. And everybody can type in your questions as we go along, especially if one question leads to another, as it often does. The first one, not necessarily in the order they came in, but just starting with the most general one. What does the word Mahjong mean?
Great question. So the name Mahjong, what you'll hear most often is that the name Mahjong means the game of the sparrows or sparrows. There is some seed of truth in that. That's not entirely the whole story. So the first name for Mahjong was written in Chinese, what would have been pronounced in Mandarin or what's spoken in Beijing as Ma Chui. However, in Shanghai, where it was developed, that would have been pronounced more like Mojiang. And so we can hear some of the roots of Mahjong rather than Ma Chui. Meanwhile, Babcock learned it in the area around Shanghai, probably heard it called something like Mojiang. When he markets it to an American audience, and I see that the question of the name of the entrepreneur, Joseph Park Babcock is his full name. He's not the only person marketing Mahjong, but again, he is the most important in this transition in the 1920s. He calls it MAH-JONGG. And he adds the double G because he wants to emphasize its exoticism. So again, kind of clarifying, this is clearly not an English word. At the same time, Mahjong is, again, spreading in popularity in China as well. Certainly in the context of this huge international fad in the 1920s, Chinese people are also saying, like, what's this game everybody's talking about? We want to pay attention to this too. And as it spreads in popularity and building on its previous popularity in Beijing, it's already getting renamed as Mahjong, which is a different character. And although Ma Chui did mean sparrows, its name today, its official name in China is Mahjong, and it doesn't mean sparrows. It doesn't really mean anything. It's connected to the sound of the name as it has continued. I call it Mahjong one word because I think that's the most kind of neutral spelling that connects these different cultural traditions that I talk about in the book. But there's lots of correct ways of spelling it. There's not just one name.
Okay. There's been a couple of comments, of course, about people smoking in all the pictures, and the women being dressed up to pearls to wear to play mahjong, which is funny because I remember one of my friend's mothers always got very dressed up to go play mahjong. And then we have a question. Chess is played by the young and old alike, but it looks like mahjong is played by an older population. Is that correct?
Thank you so much for those questions. And I'll respond to that last question first, but then I want to go back to the kind of observations of the players too, because there's meaning behind those. So Mahjong is played by all ages. Today in the American context, and actually this is partially true in China as well, it's especially actually played by an older population because of more flexible schedules after retirement, for example. But in China, families often play over Chinese New Year. It's a very, very, very popular and common game to play when families gather together for the New Year holiday. And in the United States, American Mahjong culture was associated with the kind of young chic scene in the 1920s, but was actually played again across all ages at the time too. And in the 1950s and 60s, that culture was really created by young mothers. But as that generation aged, they continued playing it, and then their daughters, many of whom did not play mahjong in the 70s and 80s, as the baby boomers retire, as that generation retires, many of them are now turning to mahjong and learning it, even if they hadn't learned it from their mothers, and in fact didn't want to be like their mothers at that time. And so those earlier the comments, the great observations about smoking and pearls, yeah, those are actually indicative and meaningful. One is that certainly, yes, as Robin said, just there was so much more smoking at that time, absolutely. But it's also true that I've interviewed people who said, yeah, but during mahjong nights, they would smoke more because it was relaxing and fun. And it's a drug. Nicotine's a drug, and it was part again of having this feeling of in one woman's words, like letting your hair down, right? That you were talking and laughing and gossiping and complaining, and smoking. And so the other comment about the pearls is, and your comment, Meg, about dressing up, is that also is indicative in interesting ways about how class sometimes functioned in these communities. And certainly there was 1950s and early 60s era different expectations about what was appropriate to wear out, or what it was like to dress up when you went somewhere. And for a lot of women, mahjong nights were the only time that they left the house without their husbands. At night, they might go elsewhere during the day, but at night, you kind of get a little dressed up, and this was the only thing that they would do on their own. And so that was a piece of it too. But I've interviewed people who said, I, or their mothers, if I'm interviewing their children, felt very intimidated or turned off by the kind of dressing up because they didn't have that much money, right? And they felt like this is an exclusive space. I'm not welcome there because I don't have the pearls. I don't have the gloves. And so it was a strongly middle class culture. But for what it's worth, I did also talk to people who were part of working class mahjong communities who didn't dress up or who didn't feel intimidated by it if they did. And so there was a big range, but I do think it's significant that there was a certain kind of element of hosting with nice china or dressing up with pearls and getting your nails done and things like that.
There's been a couple of comments that came in while you were talking. Marjorie, who says that she learned Mahjong and how to make pineapple boats from her mother. Important skills both. And Carol says how food was made an important part to the game, and the children remember enjoying the delights put out for the participants. My mother didn't play Mahjong, but my grandmother played bridge. I used to like going over there the next day and eating the leftovers. Now, Sophie wants to know, do you need to learn the Chinese characters to play the game?
Oh, good question. No, you don't. And this is actually one of the key aspects to it becoming a really popular game in the 1920s among people who didn't know how to read Chinese. What they did was so there are characters that are numbers, Chinese numbers, in American Mahjong. That's referred to as the character or crack suit. And those are, you would have to know how to read Chinese numbers in order to understand those tiles, except they then just added in the corner a little Arabic numeral. And so if you don't read the Chinese number, you can just see, oh, that's a number 2. And so that was a key change to spreading it among people who don't read or speak Chinese. Yeah.
So basically, it's a game with subtitles.
Yes.
Okay. Now, another person asks, is there a version of Mahjong that's considered the most authentic or universally accepted in the United States? And if so, is there a name for that version?
So the short answer is no. And in the book, I dig into the idea of authenticity, and I kind of trouble that idea. And I talk about some of the ways that authentic has often been attached to some kind of expectation of a culture being unchanging. And in fact, a culture is always changing, and has often been associated with stereotypical aspects of a culture as a result. At the same time, there are versions of the game that are more connected to either the traditional original Chinese version of the game, so like how it kind of stabilized in the late 19th century. There are versions of that's called the traditional Chinese game that are close to that. There are other versions that are connected to ongoing regional variations of the game in China that might be more popular in Sichuan, for example, where there's a thriving Mahjong culture today. And so there are variations in the United States that are directly connected to on kind of contemporary Chinese versions and that original form. And they have different, you might call it the Hunan variation or Sichuan or Shanghai. And then there are versions that are born of the 20th century history of the game in the United States, like Right Pat and the League's version of the game. And they have their own unique histories. So there are lots of different variations, and they do all, they're basically called a name associated with where they were developed is most common.
All right. Any more questions? Last chance. Type quickly. I'm just dragging it out just a tiny bit since we started a little bit late. People are saying thank you, which yes, of course speaks for all of us. Yes. Oh, here's another one. How many versions have you played?
I've played 2 versions, and that was the very basic traditional Chinese version that I first learned in 2007, 2008 in China, and then the National Mahjong League's version, which I learned from a great instructor in San Francisco named Toby Salk. And you have a wonderful
the classic cat incursion.
But what I'll just say is that I really think that every version has its own charms and its own challenges. And it's really where you identify that key strategy of how you win the game. And if you like one version or another, like, oh, I like the thoughts, the challenge that this version kind of sparks, then go with
Mhm.
that.
Now, here's a question just for me. If I were to wander into Chinatown in New York, and went to a Chinese grocery store and bought a Mahjong set, would it be different than one I would get from the National Mahjong Society or whatever league? Sorry.
Probably. What I will say is that there are a lot of sets that are made in China today that are aiming for flexibility. So they include, it's that the National Mahjong League's game today would require joker tiles, which you don't
Mhm.
play with in Chinese versions of the game. And so, but a lot of times sets that are made to be sold in the United States, whether or not they're going to be used, will include joker tiles so that they can have that, they can be sold to a variety of consumers. But
Okay.
if you went to that, if you went to the neighborhood association hall in Chinatown and watched people play, they wouldn't be playing with the jokers.
Right. I used to have in-laws who would play. They didn't bother teaching me, but they would play aggressively and slap their tiles around. It's like talking trash sort of thing. I never understood quite what was going on, but family stuff. Somebody asked earlier, are there a lot of house rules, in a particular family or whatever? Do people make up their own rules as well as the ones that are out there officially?
Yeah, great question. Another word for this is table rules. Table rules definitely exist and are always controversial. So, but I see it as part of the ongoing kind of adaptation and history of the game. One of the things that the league was trying to do in when they were standardizing the game is to uh, make it kind of an official set of rules that everyone could agree upon, as opposed to the 1920s when there were so many competing versions of the game that were all claiming, no, buy my version, no, buy my version, that they were all a little bit different from each other, and they were all claiming to be correct, and all claiming that there was only one correct way, that it sparked a lot of fighting, basically, of people
Hmm.
who won't sit down together. And so uh, the league's vision is to have their version be the standard national version of the game, and they are very opposed to house rules or table rules. But the reality is, table rules exist, and people can be very attached to the way, if you play with something called an atomic hand, which some people here might be familiar with. Some people are really opposed to that because they feel like it again kind of moves away from a shared base of a game and or makes things more stressful. And some people really love playing with atomic hands because they prefer the kind of speed that it creates. So again, I think it's really helpful to have like a shared base. And then I think if people want to experiment with table rules and can agree upon it, yes, those are alive and well today.
Okay. I've just noticed a question that fell in amongst all the thank yous, which of course we all
Oh,
uh, join in on. But somebody was asking if they wanted to learn to play the game. I've lost the question, but I will paraphrase. If they wanted to learn to play the game, how would you suggest getting started?
great question. So one thing to decide is, you could figure out, is there a certain version you want to learn? Do you want to learn the traditional Chinese version? Do you want to learn the Japanese version called Richi? Do you want to learn the American or National Mahjong League's version? And I would encourage you to go with whatever is most likely to connect you with a group of players near you. And so there are books, there are YouTube videos. I think hands down the most effective way to learn is to actually learn from an in-person instructor. And sometimes there are people teaching classes like at your neighborhood community center, sometimes at a library, sometimes at a JCC. sometimes in continuing adult education. So that is, those are kind of institutional ways to find an instructor. And then there are lots of independent instructors, like the person who taught me in San Francisco, Toby, who has her own business teaching Mahjong. And so there are lots of people who you could find, in your community. Facebook has a few thriving Mahjong groups, or multiple thriving Mahjong groups. Mahjong Community is one. Mahjong That's It is another. Those are two of the major ones. And you can post on those Facebook groups saying where you are, asking if anyone knows anyone in the area who's teaching, and that's another way to get connected.
It's nice to use social media as a way to find real people.
It is. And I think actually Mahjong players are really good at that. Yeah.
Definitely. All right. Well, several people say they are going to start searching for a group in their area. And several people say they're going to read your book, both of which sound like good approaches. And I'm going to say for the group, I really enjoyed this, and many people did as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
And there's no last question. So Laura will probably shut us down any second. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.